I'm glad Star Trek Discovery never went back in time. I'm glad Star Trek Discovery never used a time travel plot to go back in time. Since it brought back Star Trek after a long absence of the franchise on the small screen, Star Trek Discovery was under a lot of pressure. Fans wanted the new era of Sci-Fi TV to be precisely the kind of Star Trek fans had missed since Star Trek Enterprise ended in 2005. With such high stakes, Star Trek Discovery had to tread lightly but still boldly go, and eventually pave the way for new Star Trek TV shows and movies. Star Trek's new show had to achieve the perfect balance of nostalgia and fresh narratives. Since time travel is such a popular science fiction trope, especially in Star Trek, a time jump seemed like a good idea. Commander Michael Burnham, Sonequa Martin Green, and Star Trek Discovery's characters found themselves jumping into the next century at the end of Star Trek Discovery Season 2. Not only am I glad that the time jump wasn't into the past, but I'm also happy that Star Trek Discovery never ended up featuring a time travel plot that would have sent characters backward in the timeline. Why Star Trek Discovery going back to the 23rd century would have been a mistake from its very first season in 2017, Star Trek Discovery had a lot to prove. Taking on the mantle of the sole Star Trek TV show at the time was daunting. It had to live up to its famous predecessors, Star Trek Voyager and Star Trek Enterprise. Star Trek Discovery's Spore Drive set it apart from other Star Trek projects, as did the reintroduction of characters Lieutenant Spock, Ethan Peck, and Captain Christopher Pike, Anson Mount. However, Star Trek Discovery still had to be careful about changing too much of the already established canon, so delicate pacing was established early on. I think that if Star Trek Discovery had gone back in time, the progress it made would have been promptly destroyed. Star Trek Discovery was a serialized show, so even a one-off episode about time travel would have ruined the overarching plot and careful pacing. Star Trek creatives also undoubtedly wanted to steer clear of tropes and narratives that had been done in nearly every Star Trek TV show until that point. I'm glad Star Trek Discovery's saga was about creating new stories, not revisiting old ones for nostalgia's sake. Star Trek Discovery reconnected with Star Trek by focusing on the future. Traveling forward to the 32nd century allowed Star Trek Discovery to chart its own course in the Star Trek timeline. This was a bold and risky move, but time travel gave Star Trek Discovery a new lease on life and ensured it didn't get caught in the web of established canon, which is really tricky to do. Star Trek Discovery needed space to be what it needed to be, and the 32nd century provided that space. Going back, even with a single episode time travel plot, would have risked the show's precariously balanced development and set it back, literally. Star Trek Strange New Worlds, the spin-off of Star Trek Discovery, continues to bring back classic Star Trek in a lot of new and exciting ways. The pressure Star Trek Discovery had when it started eventually lessened, allowing its later seasons to take even bolder narrative leaps and test the limits of what fans thought Star Trek had to be. I think traveling back in time would have erased the effort Star Trek Discovery made in its first few seasons to stand apart but still be adjacent to previous Star Trek shows and movies. Sarah Marshall, Kirk's girlfriend in Star Trek TOS The Deadly Years, explained. Sarah Marshall played Janet Wallace, one of the many girlfriends of Captain James T. Kirk, William Shatner, in Star Trek The Original Series. While Kirk had multiple romances during TOS, his 5-year mission also brought him into contact with a few old flames. For example, Kirk's ex, Janice Lester, Sandra Smith, was the primary antagonist in Turnabout Intruder, the final episode before Star Trek was canceled in 1969. Sarah Marshall's Janet Wallace was another of Kirk's old flames, but she came aboard the USS Enterprise to help its captain, not hinder him. Janet Wallace only appeared once in Star Trek The Original Series, Season 2, Episode 11, The Deadly Years, in which she helped Dr. McCoy, DeForest Kelley, to cure the rapid aging virus that was ravaging the crew. Interestingly, there were plans to reunite Sarah Marshall as Janet Wallace with the Star Trek TOS cast in the movies, but they were ultimately abandoned. Despite Sarah Marshall's abandoned Star Trek comeback, she still made a memorable appearance in The Deadly Years. Sarah Marshall played Kirk's girlfriend Janet Wallace in Star Trek TOS The Deadly Years. In Star Trek The Original Series, Season 2, Episode 11, The Deadly Years, Janet Wallace was assigned to the USS Enterprise for a mission to Gamma Hydra 4, during which Kirk and his away team succumbed to unknown radiation. It was revealed in The Deadly Years that Janice and Kirk had been a couple in 2261, but both abandoned their relationship in favor of their careers. Janet Wallace was a scientist specializing in endocrinology and cell structure, which enabled her to reverse the effects of the radiation in time for Kirk to retake control of the Enterprise from an inept Starfleet Commodore. Sarah Marshall had been performing on stage and screen for over a decade before her appearance in Star Trek, the original series. In 1960, Marshall was nominated as Best Supporting or Featured Actress Dramatic at the Tony Awards for her role in Goodbye, Charlie. In 1964, Sarah Marshall married Christopher Held, the actor who played Lindstrom in Star Trek TOS Season 1, Episode 22, Return of the Arkans. As well as movie roles in Dave and Dangerous Minds, Marshall also had a string of guest spots in classic TV shows like Alfred Hitchcock Presents, The Twilight Zone, and Cheers. Star Trek Movies' Carol Marcus's connection to Sarah Marshall and Janet Wallace in Star Trek, the original series' second pilot, Where No Man Has Gone Before. Gary Mitchell, Gary Lockwood, mentions a little blonde lab assistant that Kirk was previously engaged to. Janet Wallace's appearance in The Deadly Years heavily suggested that this was who Gary was referring to. However, that became more complicated with the introduction of Dr. Carol Marcus, B.B. Besh, in Star Trek II, The Wrath of Khan. Interestingly, an early draft of Khan featured Janet Wallace as the head of the Omega system, a new and devastating weapon. Later drafts replaced Wallace with Carol and Omega with the Genesis device. However, that wasn't the end of Janet Wallace and Sarah Marshall's links to the Star Trek movies. Alice Eve's Carol Marcus in Star Trek Into Darkness is first introduced as Carol Wallace, adopting her mother's birth name rather than her father's surname. This nod to Sarah Marshall's Star Trek, the original series character, became particularly poignant as Star Trek Into Darkness was released in 2012, the same year that Marshall made her last screen appearance in the movie Bad Blood. 2 years later, Sarah Marshall passed away, leaving behind one of Captain Kirk's more memorable ex-girlfriends. Star Trek's new God-level space station is so unique, even Geordi LaForge is starstruck. There is a new space station in the Star Trek universe, and its design and architecture have left even Geordi LaForge starstruck. In Star Trek Annual 2024, LaForge teams up with Data and O'Brien to find Data's evil brother Lore. Their search first takes them to some of the galaxy's seediest locales, and then finally to a God-level space station that leaves LaForge's jaw on the floor. Star Trek Annual 2024 was written by Jackson Lansing and Colin Kelly and drawn by Rachel Stott. Data, LaForge, and O'Brien are tracking Lore, as well as the renegade Klingon scientist Korath. The trio finds Korath on a massive space station that, in the words of Chief O'Brien, docked right into the accretion disk of a black hole. Something aboard the station is emanating various forms of radiation, causing subspace ripples. Geordi LaForge has seen some engineering miracles in his day. Geordi LaForge is one of the best engineers in Starfleet history, and Star Trek Annual 2024 marks his and Chief O'Brien's entrance into the massive story playing out in IDW's Trek line. Data, Geordi's best friend, is recruited by Ben Sisko to Thethesus, tasked with hunting down the Klingon Emperor Kallus. Kallus and his genocidal Red Path had declared war on the universe's godlike beings. LaForge had been absent from the story, but Data's decision to leave Starfleet to search for Lore has brought them back together.